You're listening to Soundside. I'm KUOW's Paige Browning, in for Libby Dinkman. Seattle has been a target of anti-car activism since at least the early 1960s, when the construction of I-5 carved up the Chinatown International District. One Seattle architect even said the creation of the freeway signaled when Seattle started to lose its identity as a city. Even so, what would a less car-centric Seattle be like? Can you imagine it? Some people can, and they're trying to help others see the possibilities. Doug Gordon and Sarah Goodyear are the hosts of a podcast called The War on Cars, and they've written a new book, Life After Cars, Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile. They're both based in Brooklyn, New York, but are in studio with me here in Seattle. Doug and Sarah, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, first, your podcast, The War on Cars, can be adversarial, and it makes no secret about that. The title says it itself. Not especially subtle about your perspective. Sarah, in your book, the title includes mentioning the tyranny of cars. What do you mean by that? Unpack the title a little bit for us.
So the thing about the way that cars have been integrated into our modern society, well, they haven't really been integrated. They've dictated our modern society. And most people in the United States of America have no choice but to use a car to do their daily business. And indeed, if you can't use a car, if you don't have a driver's license, like 30% of Americans, young, elderly, some of them undocumented, if you can't use a car, then you're not really a fully enfranchised member of the society in most of the United States of America. And we don't believe that should be the case. We believe that people should be able to move about their communities, get to work, education, opportunities, healthcare facilities, that those things should be accessible easily and inexpensively, even if you don't have a car. And that cars should not be the standard that we measure everything by, and they shouldn't dictate all of our infrastructure, all of our transportation spending. We need to diversify our modes. And so for us, saying that we want to free ourselves from the tyranny of the automobile means exactly that we want freedom of choice for people, and that we don't want people to be enthralled to cars, whether they like it or not.
I thought it was interesting in your book, even very early in the book, how you talk about how standardized cars are, to the point where, to me, they're basically invisible. And you talk about, look at the cars. And you talk about not calling it a parking lot, but car storage, because we almost just don't even see it. It's just so ingrained. Doug, I wonder also what you have to say about this idea of the tyranny of cars.
Yeah, I think we have some experience, unfortunately, right now in the United States with thinking about tyranny and what it means. And usually what it means is that you are never not thinking about the tyrant, right? It dictates every facet of your life. And if you really think about driving, over 90% of Americans drive every day. And a challenge to your listeners might be to think about, when is the last time you just went more than 48 hours without getting into a car, being near a car, hearing a car? Probably the answer is almost never. Our whole lives are devoted and shaped by cars. So freeing ourselves from the tyranny of the automobile means could you go a little longer without thinking about getting in a car, having to get the kids in the car to go to school or soccer practice, or taking an elderly relative to a medical appointment or something like that. And it's a much more free life when you have alternatives to this tyrant that rules your life.
And I should say, this idea can be uncomfortable for people.
Yes.
And the subject of cars gets really touchy really quickly. It can make people emotional and sometimes aggressive. I have little experience here, but I've been yelled at car drivers while I'm on their bicycle while I'm on my bicycle because they perceive that like I'm in their space or something.
Yeah.
And Doug, I'm thinking about what you wrote about in the New York City public meeting in which a speaker who was pro-cars actually shoved you. What inspires such a reaction? Which, by the way, this goes by the name bike lash, I'm told.
Yes. But yeah, I think because most Americans are subject to this tyrant that we're talking about, they can't imagine another way. And it can be very frightening. How am I going to get to work? And they see things in absolute terms, and that's not what we're arguing. If you need to drive, you'll keep driving. It's more, can we just make it safer for your neighbors who want to bike their kids to school? And that's why I think hopefully people don't get shoved at community meetings like I did once. But it can get very touchy because it's like an entire way of life that we're thinking of. We're asking people to question, and they've never questioned it. So they can naturally get very defensive, which is understandable.
And it's been part of this sort of visual of American life for a while. You're on the open road. You have freedom.
Are you really on the open road, though? Or are you sitting in traffic?
Say more about that, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I don't think that vision of auto mobility that car companies sell to you in the advertisements that you see constantly on your TV, on your laptop, everywhere you go, that is not a kind of driving that really exists very much in the real world. You're certainly not driving through empty cities all by yourself in your car very often. You're not, I mean, many people, and I have seen it while I've been in Seattle, saw it on the bridge over to Bellevue, are sitting in traffic. They're sitting in traffic, and that is not freedom. And so I think that the idea of freedom and the idea of sort of the rugged individual in their ship that they're piloting through the world, it's something that's easy to sell to Americans because that kind of rugged individualism is very much what we're encouraged to think of as Americans, as being sort of the way that Americans are. We're all rugged individualists. But the truth is that in your car, you are often just a mass of, you're stuck in this mass of other people, but you can't even experience them as human beings. And you talked about having people yell at you when you're on your bicycle when they're in cars. But I find that when I'm driving, I turn into a not very nice person.
Oh, me too.
Almost instantly, right? It's like, because when you're in your car, everyone else is in your way. When you're on a bicycle, other people are people that you're riding with, and it's nice to ride with them.
And safer. The more cyclists there are on the road, the safer you are, even if you're riding in a place with very little bike infrastructure. More people is a great thing. It's a great thing on public transit. It's a great thing when you're walking downtown. It's a great thing when you're cycling. It's a horrible thing when you're driving. That's like the worst thing that could happen to you is if you wake up and hit the quote-unquote open road and find out that, oh gosh, you know what? Turns out everybody else is driving to work at the same time I am. That's bad.
I do know, this is example of one, but in my 3.5 mile commute to work, it usually takes more time for me to drive than for me to take. I have access to what we call a rapid ride bus here in Seattle, or to bike. But I do want to acknowledge some criticism of this movement. Sarah, I'll start with you here. You acknowledge in the book that there is a perception that the movement away from cars is rooted in lots of types of privilege, in urban elites, white activists, people who are have the physical ability to jump on a bike or walk long distances. How do you respond to that?
So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that especially Black and brown communities have a good reason to be skeptical of urban planners coming in and saying, hey, we're going to improve your neighborhood, because historically, not only has that meant we're actually going to knock down everything in your neighborhood, but then it's meant after that, we're going to build things here that are going to displace you and you're not going to be able to be there. So I think it's really important for planners and advocates and anybody who's interested in making change in this area to acknowledge that history and to be really real about it. But the fact is that Black and brown communities suffer a higher rate of traffic crashes, traffic injuries, fatalities. They're disproportionately impacted by environmental toxins that are associated with driving, air quality, asthma rates, et cetera, et cetera. And not to mention the legacy of roads like I-5 going through Seattle, right?
Right through the Chinatown International District and more. Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to just acknowledge it and to say, yeah, we need to form alliances with those groups that are criticizing us. And people in the advocacy community, I think, have been doing that work, and it's been getting better over the time that I've been looking at this. And part of it is like there's now bike advocacy is not siloed the way it used to be. It's more allied with other progressive movements, including especially the climate movement and the affordable housing movement.
Doug, I'm curious what you think as well, this idea of this being a solution that maybe works for urban white elites. Have you ever found that you've had to shift your thinking to address these concerns, or what's your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, we are, in a way, two stereotypes of the movement, if you really just want to kind of be surface level about it, right? We both are from gentrified areas of Brooklyn. We're both white. We have the privilege to do some of the things that we get to do. But I think I would want to tackle the idea, first of all, I think ableism is also a big issue here and inherent in your question. As Sarah mentioned earlier, about 30% of Americans cannot or do not drive for various reasons. Now, some of that is due to disability. They are not physically able to drive. But of those people, many can walk or cycle. There are plenty of disabilities that do not impact someone's ability to walk or get on a bike.
Potentially a visual disability.
Exactly.
Something.
Yeah. Well, we had Anna Zivarts, who is based here.
Oh, right.
And she wrote a really great book about non-drivers and really talks about how these people are left out of the conversation about planning. And like Sarah said, it includes children. It includes the elderly. It includes undocumented people who don't have, cannot get a driver's license. It includes people who just have chosen, for whatever reason, anxiety. They just don't want to drive. And we can build a place where if you have options, that 3-mile, commute that you're talking about would be really easy on an electric tricycle for someone, for example, right? If you have balance issues, or if the bus comes frequently enough and you can just roll on in a wheelchair, you don't have to worry about relying on another person or sort of like accessible, ride services or things like that. So, we're not an absolutist movement. We really believe in giving people options. And the movement, as Sarah was sort of saying, is really no longer a monolith in that sense. It really is reaching out across different movements and bringing people in. Look, I have been a kind of big figure in this movement for a long time, and I'm a white male, cisgender white male. The biggest thing I say to other people like me is just know when not to talk.
I'm Paige Browning, in for Libby Dinkman, here on Soundside. We're talking with Sarah Goodyear and Doug Gordon, the hosts of the War on Cars podcast. Coming up, the connection between salmon deaths and poisonous car tires, plus what you can do to make your neighborhood less dependent on cars. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Paige Browning. That's in just a minute, right here on KUOW. Welcome back to Soundside. I'm Paige Browning, in for Libby Dinkman. We're talking with Doug Gordon and Sarah Goodyear, the hosts of the War on Cars podcast. They've got a new book out called Life After Cars, Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile. So I understand you both took a ride with the Cascade Bicycle Club here in town just yesterday, and they're actually not far from the KUOW studios. Where did you go, and what did you notice on the ride? Doug, you go first.
Yeah, we went downtown to check out the growing bike lane network there.
Yeah.
So I'll start there. I think Seattle has some of the best urban bike infrastructure of any major American city.
That's a big statement.
Yeah, I think what they're building out in the downtown especially is really good. Curb protected, low concrete barriers, two-way bike lanes, bike signals. It's very inviting to ride on. It's very safe feeling. So that was great. We rode along the waterfront, along the Alaskan Way, what used to be the viaduct there and now has been completely transformed. So that was great too, really comfortable. There's some pinch points and obviously nothing's perfect, but it was really, I thought, great. And then we rode out to West Seattle to see some of the progress that is happening there. And obviously that's in a different state than a lot of the downtown, but again, very impressive.
Were you taken through bike lanes and also onto arterials without protected bike lanes?
We saw the good, the bad, and the ugly.
There
for
we
sure.
go.
That's always the way to do it.
Good.
Yes.
Sarah, what about you?
Well, I was really struck by the infrastructure that went through some of the port area and the industrial area over by the Duwamish Longhouse. We went out there, and that was really interesting because we talked about how having a bike lane in that particular place was helping to connect that sort of ancestral tradition of people being there in a safer way. And they actually had bike racks installed out there because there weren't bike racks out there. And so that's such a tough area to be a human being in, with all those huge trucks going back and forth with cargo and freight and high speeds and a lot of industrial uses. But what was really interesting was to be in an environment like that and have it be a safe environment to ride in. And I think that's so important, to not just have infrastructure in sort of the obvious places where tourists are, or where a lot of the working, a lot of the sort of white collar workers are, but that you also have to put infrastructure that connects more far-flung communities, and especially in Seattle, which is so divided geographically by water, by hills, by industry. Making those connections, it seems, is like pretty vital work for advocates here.
Yeah, because not every bike ride or walk in the city is just to go down to Pike Place Market. That is one feature of the city, but more realistically, people are going to West Seattle and need to get across the West Seattle Bridge, where there is a special bike lane that you can avoid traffic or get, up the hill, get up Capitol Hill or wherever you might be going. Now, this is the fun part. We're going to hear from some listeners.
Oh, cool.
So we asked
Love
our
this.
audience to let us know about their relationship with cars. Okay. And we got a lot of responses.
Oh, my God. This is so great.
People have thoughts. So here's a voicemail from Manita, who lives in Northgate.
I am a deep ecologist. I care very much about the planet. And I also love driving. I love Formula One, and I love driving. And I lived all over the world. I lived in London for a very long time before I came here. I swore I would never get a car here. And the bus system drove me nuts.
Sounds like someone who's feeling a little inner conflict about driving here, Manita. We also got an interesting email from Christina in Redmond. Here's what Christina told us, as read by a Soundside producer.
For years, I resisted owning a car. When I lived in San Francisco, I managed perfectly well without one. But after the pandemic, my employer required in-office attendance and my commute stretched to more than an hour. After a long deliberation, I made the painful decision to buy a Toyota Prius, a hybrid, since I lived in an apartment with nowhere to charge an electric car. The only charger was at work. Even so, I loathed driving.
So these are people who ideally would love to be car-free, it sounds like, but the time cost was too much, or they couldn't find good alternatives to cars in the city. What do you make of that, Doug?
Yeah, we'd never wag our fingers at people. If you need a car because your commute is too long, too inconvenient, the bus doesn't show up frequently enough, as both of those people were saying, great, get a car. Like what we're arguing for are systemic solutions to problems so that individuals can make the decisions that work best for them. So they shouldn't feel guilty. We are two New York-based urbanites. If you picked us up and plopped us in a rural community in the Pacific Northwest or an exurb of Dallas, chances are we would need to get cars. That's just how it works. But I think what we're arguing in the book, and it seems like we have two allies in these listeners, are people who say, oh man, like it would be better. Like maybe we could help the bus show up a little more frequently by getting the traffic out of the way and giving the bus its own lane, or increasing funding. Seattle often has levies on, to increase transit funding that could add more buses to the fleet and more drivers and bus operators so the bus could show up more frequently. Maybe we could look at land use so that office is not located so far from where she lives, or vice versa, more dense infill housing so that people could afford to live closer to where they work. So these are larger, bigger institutional problems that will take a lot of time to solve, but we don't ever want people to feel guilty
There's
about
no
their
finger
personal...
wagging.
No, that's like...
Not on this advice section.
No, for not. Definitely not.
This is also reminding me of, there are people who are trying to take action here in Seattle around these issues. In the last few months, there was an event called Race the Late. This is about racing bus line number 8 from one point to the next, which most people could do by like hopscotching or whatnot because of the slowness. So there's movement to get transportation, transit to be better here. I want to read another one. This one's more about safety concerns. Christine in Greenwood texted us saying, there are long stretches of Greenwood Avenue without crosswalks, and trying to cross can be risky. We desperately need more crosswalks and traffic calming measures, but the city ignores our requests. Safer pedestrian infrastructure would get me back on foot again. And this is a story that I relate to deeply. I grew up in sort of a suburban-like city, Spokane. Everyone drives. Riding the bus wasn't that common growing up. Biking was very hilly, so families just sort of relied on cars. And that, over time, I think has led within my own family to sort of a fear around not using a car to get around, and especially a lack of sidewalks. That can feel scary to send your kids out to, or even for me to walk out in. Sarah, I see you eager to respond here.
Yeah, it is scary. And, I really feel for Christine and her struggle, because you go out into these environments and you want to walk, and yet it's so unpleasant. It's so frightening. There's cars just whizzing by. It's bleak. If it's the summertime, it can be just deadeningly hot. And, it's just not designed for people walking. And what I think we need to do is to get elected officials and planners out into those places and have them experience what people experience when they're on foot in those communities. And we talk in the book about precisely this issue of crosswalks and where they're put. And, a planner will say, oh, we'll have crosswalks every third of a mile without even beginning to understand what that means to somebody who's coming home from a grocery store, who has children with them. And, walking a third of a mile to get to a crosswalk can be really onerous. So I think we need to have the people who are in power to make these decisions to actually experience what some of their constituents are experiencing, and not to just drive around in cars all the time.
I know there is sort of a voluntary effort here in Seattle where once a year elected leaders, some of them, do this. They get around car-free for about a week. I wonder, is there data to back up or research to back up that moving toward a pedestrian or bike infrastructure is a better system than what we're living in now?
Well, people often default to the economic argument. You hear a lot of arguments against cycling of like, cyclists can't shop, they don't spend money, because we have this idea that you go to Costco and you load up your trunk and you spend $300 on groceries that'll last you for, however long. But there are studies that show actually that cyclists, when they live in places where it's enabled for them to go cycling, spend more money. They make more frequent visits to local stores. They're shopping at local stores and not the big box stores on the edge of town. So there's an economic argument that this is better. And of course, children's autonomy is a big one as well. Like giving children the freedom to navigate their communities on their own through safe crosswalks, safe bike lanes, denser development that allows them access to stores and parks and their own schools and their friends' homes. Those things are really great for childhood development. That gives them a better sense, a cognitive sense of the world around them, and also fosters something I think most parents want in their children, which is like learning how to be independent as well.
I want to bring up before we run out of time, I want to bring up the environmental factors here. Sarah, I particularly enjoyed your chapter about salmon, roads, and tire pollution. Can you tell us a little more about what University of Washington scientists discovered about how the pollution from car tires harms one of our most beloved species, the salmon here in the Northwest?
Yeah, this is really important work that's been done here in Washington State. What was happening was they were noticing that the coho salmon were having these big die-offs occasionally, and researchers couldn't figure out what was triggering those. And eventually, after years of research, they noticed that they would happen after a heavy rainfall had caused a lot of runoff to come off the roads. And
which happens frequently. We've had it in the last couple weeks here in Seattle.
Exactly. And that if that happens to coincide with the presence of the salmon there, that they would be dying. But still, they couldn't figure out what was it in the runoff that was causing this problem. And they spent a lot of time trying to isolate different compounds. And part of the problem is that automakers, like a lot of people who deal in chemicals in this country, don't have to disclose certain things. If it's a proprietary formula, that they can just say, well, we have these things in here, but we're not going to tell you exactly what it's in. But that was the case with tires. And after a long and painstaking research process, the researchers isolated 6-ppd quinone, which is a chemical compound that arises when tire dust interacts with exhaust fumes. And it was that was causing the salmon to die. And so, I mean, in one way, it's just such a great story because you can see how the power of science and the power of research is able to take a problem that seems like incredibly mysterious and sad and how are we ever going to know what's causing this? They figure out what the cause is. But the sad part is that it's such a huge and sort of, in a way, amorphous problem, even though the tires themselves are, very concrete objects. The idea that we're just going to change the formulation of all the tires that have ever been done, how are we going to make this happen? And so some scientists are advocating to have, filtration marshes essentially kind of planted
to grab
alongside
that before it gets into the water.
Exactly. And that could be sort of a thing that would be like guardrails that in future codes, engineering codes for highway construction, you could have there. We know that there's a sensitive stream in this area. And so you're going to have to provide filtration marshes. But, these are the things that sometimes you just say, wouldn't it just be easier to not have so many tires?
To not have the tire in the first
place. And the other thing, too, is that the salmon are agnostic as to whether that car that is creating the runoff is gas-powered or electric.
That's a good point. The solution might not just be electric cars.
Right. We should absolutely have as many electric cars as possible to eliminate tailpipe emissions. But electric cars are often heavier because of their batteries, and so the tire wear is even worse. And so those salmon are going to be exposed to these compounds regardless of whether or not we make the switch. And so what we're sort of arguing is like, yes, electric cars, but fewer cars overall is going to be the goal.
Our environment reporter here, John Ryan, has covered this quite heavily, and it's I think has surprised a lot of people that their act of driving could so directly be killing our local salmon. Before we go, I do want to read a couple more messages.
Yeah, these are great.
We also got some messages from the Soundside Text Club. One of them reads, in all caps, ride bikes every day. Okay, so I'll just leave that one.
Okay.
And another says, riding public transportation also gives you the opportunity to meet people outside your own tribe. So some notes for us to chew on as we end our segment. But I do want to talk about the end of the book a little bit, which includes some calls to action. Some of these focus on individual work. So that would be an individual calling elected officials, rephrasing parking as car storage, putting a cone near a dangerous corner, some solutions here. That's a narrower set of actions than in recent years when a lot of activists tried to get concessions from corporations like big oil companies or car companies. And I'm wondering, why do you think it's important to focus on individual action?
Yeah, I think we want to be careful because, like, we're not saying, look, if we had ended the book of like, here's what you can do, install a bike lane on your street. You can't do that. You need institutions. You need your, SDOT, you need the mayor's office, you need statewide officials to do that. But change does start with us. I think, so we always have to be careful about, like, we're not going to solve climate change with recycling and everyone switching to electric cars, but those changes aren't going to happen until people at the bottom, the grassroots, really speaks up and calls their elected officials. So we didn't want to be too prescriptive with our solutions in the end. We wanted them to feel achievable. Like, I can't fix some of the problems in this country. They're just so big. But I can know who my local elected official is, and I can call her and say, oh, that new bike lane on my street, thank you for supporting it. Or, hey, there's a dangerous intersection in my neighborhood. Have you thought about what we could do to fix it? And building that political support, because the people who stand to lose their quote unquote parking or their driving privileges to go 55 miles an hour down the street, they're going to call that elected official and say, don't you touch my parking. So I think what we wanted to do was give people the achievable tools. We are not saying, like your texter, everybody ride a bike, but
every day.
Right, every day. But everybody could call their elected official every once in a while and say, you might be hearing from the people who are against this. I want to tell you I'm in favor of this.
Yeah, and also one of the things we say is find your people. And that is a collective effort. Find people who care about this stuff, whether it's a bicycle club or an environmental group near you. And those organizations do lobby for these bigger systemic changes. And you can be part of something bigger.
And before we go, I want you both to describe the type of cities you're advocating for. What would they look like? How would that type of city work? And are there any real-life locations that immediately come to mind?
The first thing that I think of is not something actually we talk about specifically in the book, but there's this idea in urbanism of the popsicle test, which is basically, could your child, 6, 7, 8 years old, leave your home or your apartment, go to a neighboring store, get a popsicle, and come home before it melts? And I think we need more planning from that perspective. Literally from the perspective of someone who is like 3 or 4 feet tall and, 8 or 9 years old. And to me, that is the test of a great city or a great town, right? It doesn't have to be downtown Seattle or Manhattan. It can be a traditional small town. The places I think of that are doing it best, I think, Seattle has a lot of great examples. We've been in Minneapolis, and they have lots of single family home residence neighborhoods with excellent bike infrastructure, with off-street paths and bike lanes, with really good bus networks and things like that enable those freedoms. Obviously people point to the marquee cities of, Amsterdam and Paris. We went to Ghent for the book in Belgium, and that's a very small city, about 260,000 people. And they have more or less eliminated cut-through car traffic in the center of the city. And that has led to an absolute explosion in the number of walking and cycling trips and lowered nitrous oxide levels by about 40% from prior to this plan that they implemented.
Yeah, and I would just say that the city that we envision is much quieter and it's much less stressful to be in. Cities aren't loud, cars are loud. And you see this in a city like Madrid, where they've taken plazas that used to be parking lots and they've made them back into plazas. And at night, you just hear the sound of people's voices laughing and talking and flirting and being with each other. And that's really the city that I love to be in and I love to imagine, is one in which you're just with other people and you can appreciate what it is to be human because you're in a human scale environment.
Doug Gordon and Sarah Goodyear are the hosts of the podcast, The War on Cars, and their new book is called Life After Cars, Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile. Doug, Sarah, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
This was great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.